What if the one you tried to forget reappears in your life, and you realize that everything you left behind never truly disappeared? Sarah always believed that happiness wasn't something abstract, but something tangible, like the morning coffee that Thomas brought her in bed, or that first look full of love he gave her when they met. And everything was going smoothly: her career, their home, little Jacob, who filled their days with his mischievousness. Who could have thought that their perfect life would one day crumble like a house of cards? That terrible accident. Sarah still couldn't believe she survived it. That day she kissed Jacob on the cheek as she sent him off to meet his friends, and just a few hours later her life felt unbearably empty and dark. Jacob was dead, and all she could do was sit in their empty apartment, consumed by the darkness that offered no escape. Thomas, he buried himself in work, just like he always did when he didn't know how to cope with pain. But every day he became more distant from her. Everything between them dissolved like snow under the sun. They stopped talking, stopped noticing each other. She stopped looking for meaning in life, and he, meaning in their marriage. They just existed together, like two people who had once been happy but were now unrecognizable. Sarah continued working in her small design studio, but there was no inspiration. She just did her job like a robot, with empty eyes, looking at her work but not seeing it. Each day was like the one before it, gray and dull. I need to change something, she thought. But it seemed unlikely that anything could comfort her. Sarah had learned to endure pain. She had learned to live with that terrible emptiness inside. But Thomas had become her invisible enemy. She knew their divorce was inevitable, like rain after a hot summer. They had once loved each other, but now their relationship was as empty and impenetrable as the night sky. One evening, Sarah was sitting on the balcony, listening to the soft sound of rain outside and thinking about what might bring her back to life. She decided that she probably needed something more than just work. She had to find a way to break free from this cycle of pain, and she was ready for anything. And then, like thunder on a clear day, she received a letter from Thomas. The letter was short, but clear. "Sarah, I'm coming to the city. I'd like to see you. Can we meet?" Sarah dropped the letter from her hands. It was strange that after all these years, Thomas suddenly wanted to see her. It had been a long time since their divorce, and her life had moved on while his. Had he suddenly remembered her? And who writes to an ex after so many years? Without thinking, she placed her coffee cup on the table, put on her high heels, and decided to meet him. At least to get answers to all those questions she had tortured herself with all these years. Why did they split? Why did everything happen the way it did? Why had her life turned out so tragically? Maybe he just feels guilty, Sarah thought, hoping to at least understand a little bit of what was going on in his head. But whatever the reason, Sarah couldn't delay the meeting. She wasn't ready for the person she had once loved to show up again. The mysterious laughter, the joy, the lightness, all that was in the past. The person sitting across from her at the small cafe table was a stranger, someone who didn't know her and didn't know how much pain she had endured. But perhaps he knew how much pain he himself had felt, and maybe that was the beginning of something new. What are we going to do with each other? The question hung in the air, but neither of them dared to answer it. Sarah entered the cafe with a sense of slight awkwardness, the kind that arises when you meet someone with whom you once shared every morning. And now, well, now it felt more like an accidental encounter with someone in a store, when you suddenly realize you've run out of money and only have loose change left in your pocket. Thomas sat in the corner at the little table where they once spent hours in the evening, pretending not to notice the cracks forming in their relationship. He looked different, older, a little more solid, but in his eyes there was still that same childlike naivete, the belief that everything will be okay. "Sarah," he said, rising to his feet, a smile spreading across his face as though he had unexpectedly found a lost toy. And honestly, that smile stirred a kind of light sadness in her, as if she were standing on the threshold of returning to those carefree days when everything was simpler, and happiness was just a word everyone said. You look the same as always, just a bit more beautiful with age, like wine, you know. Sarah lowered her gaze to the table to hide how her jaw nearly dropped at that strange compliment. Flirting like this after 10 years of divorce? This person definitely shouldn't have written. Thanks, Thomas. You too. Like wine, yes. Only with every year you're getting more sour and dry, she smirked, sitting down at the table opposite. Too much work, huh? I guess that's your salvation. You know, Sarah, I really thought work would be my escape, but… Thomas trailed off, staring at the empty coffee cup. But nothing works. It feels like I've lost something in this process. And it's not just work. Sarah raised an eyebrow and, sitting in her chair like a cat on high furniture, shrugged her shoulder. She had always had a tendency for small sarcasms, and now there was a needed bitterness in her words. Of course, who else, if not her, knew how much pain they had both been through? Yeah, Thomas. We all lost something. You lost, well, us. I lost myself. Oh, and by the way, also the time that you can never get back, she added with a touch of sarcasm, though her tone was more empty than angry. Thomas fell silent as though unsure of what to respond. All those years of silence now poured out in this moment, and they filled the space between them with empty words, like a tide on an old beach. He sighed, and Sarah felt how heavy it was for him in this silence. We lost Jacob, Sarah. His voice grew quieter. I tried to forget, but every day, I don't know what happened to me. I thought work would help, that if I just worked I wouldn't think about it. But I can't. I can't. Sarah's gaze clouded. Jacob. They both lost him. They both. But each had fought with it in their own way. And if Thomas thought that diving into work was the answer, she had been searching for a way to disappear in her pain. And even now, after all these years, she couldn't fully let go of the memories of their son. His laughter, his smile, and every corner of their house remained in her memory. Everything that once seemed inevitable had now become part of that terrifying emptiness. Do you want to say something? Sarah asked, feeling how the conversation was unintentionally pulling her into the past. Thomas raised his eyes, and suddenly his gaze became clear, just like that moment when they first met, and the whole world seemed simple and understandable. I want to forgive myself, he sighed, lowering his head again. And I want you to forgive me. Sarah raised an eyebrow. There it was, the very phrase she had been waiting for, though maybe she hadn't even realized it. Somehow it was funny that all these years she had built up armor to not hear this. But now, when he said it, she felt uneasy. It was so painful and yet liberating at the same time. You want me to forgive you? Sarah laughed briefly, a flicker of bitterness shining in her eyes. Are you serious? Do you even remember how it all was? Or was I just a small detail in your life plan, easily forgotten? Thomas looked like a trapped animal, trying to find words that might bring her back to them, to the past. But time couldn't be rewound, and he knew it. I don't know what will happen next, Sarah, but I want to at least try. Try again. Sarah remained silent. In that moment, she felt like a butterfly caught in a web. It seemed like she wanted to fly forward, but this unbearable try again drained her of strength. Try again. She smiled, but it was a smile that looked more like pity for herself. Try again. What? Seriously, Thomas, I don't even know if I want to try. There was a hint of sadness in her voice, but something on his face made her fall silent. Then she simply looked at him like a stranger she once loved, but perhaps could no longer forgive. But maybe, just maybe, she would give him a chance. After all, who, if not him, could return even a little bit of that morning when they were happy. After brewing another cup of coffee, Sarah brought the cup to her lips, trying to hide the emotions that had now become part of her daily life. The cafe was just as she remembered it, cozy with wooden tables and the smell of old coffee, and it was here that she and Thomas had once first realized they were meant for each other. Or so it seemed. Life, as always, decided to set things up a little differently. Sarah, you couldn't forgive me, could you? Thomas looked at her again, like a painting that was both familiar and completely foreign. He held his breath like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to step forward or not. Sarah slowly set the cup aside and looked up, her eyes now devoid of the spark that was there when she sat with him in their shared home. Her face remained calm, but inside it felt like a storm was brewing. Could she forgive someone who had once been everything and now was just a memory that hurt? You want me to forgive you for everything? Her voice was cold, but it carried such depth of pain that Thomas could have drowned in it. You want me to become that woman again, the one you looked at like your queen? He was silent. Honestly, Thomas didn't know how to talk about what had happened. They had lost Jacob, and that had been a mutual disaster for both of them. But now, in this moment when they met again, he realized that none of those words could bring them back to life, and certainly not bring them back to happiness. Sarah was no longer the woman he fell in love with, and he knew that. We both destroyed everything, Sarah, he confessed, lowering his gaze. Both you and I. But I needed to say this. I'm willing to do anything so that you can at least feel that I deserve a chance for both of us. Sarah laughed quietly. This laugh was full of pain, sarcasm, and everything that had become harder for her to hide with each passing year. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held back, trying not to show her weakness. You're telling me again that you want to try? Sarah paused for a moment, her voice barely audible. We both lost Jacob, Thomas, and now you're offering what? To be happy again? You're saying that to me as if I can forget what happened. Thomas felt her words wound him deeply. He knew he had destroyed their happiness, and he felt ashamed. He wanted to fix it, but didn't know how. He reached out to her, but Sarah pulled away as if her pain was too intense for a touch to help. You know, Thomas, she said, her voice now firm, I don't know what to do with this. You say you're willing to do everything, but you've forgotten what it means to love. You just don't know what it's like to live with this pain every day. Thomas sighed. He wanted to say something comforting, but it seemed that all the words he had were too weak for this moment. You can forgive me, Sarah. You just have to do it, he said softly. You deserve to be happy again. And I do too. Sarah closed her eyes and felt a tear roll down her cheek. She couldn't explain why it hurt so much. Why did Thomas still say these words that sounded like forgiveness, but were actually just an attempt to deal with his guilt? He didn't know what she had gone through all these years. He didn't know how hard it had been for her to stay alive. You think it's easy, don't you? She sharply looked at him. You think I can just forget? We both lost something we'll never get back. But you don't understand. You don't understand how much it hurts now. Thomas, realizing how his words weren't reaching her, closed his eyes. He knew they couldn't go back. They couldn't return to what they once had. He knew he had been too late with this letter, with this meeting. What now, Sarah? His voice was hopeless. How do I deal with this? Sarah slowly stood up from the table and walked to the window. She gazed out at the street where the city lights twinkled. The city that had once been their home, and now was just a backdrop to their empty lives. She turned to Thomas and said quietly, I don't know, Thomas. I don't know. And no matter how much she tried, she understood that this moment was too heavy for both of them. They had lost everything. And maybe forgiveness wasn't what they needed. What they needed was time. and perhaps they would find it somewhere else. Thomas stood up, walked to the door, but didn't leave. He turned around and quietly said, "I'll wait, and maybe one day you'll forgive me." Sarah didn't respond. She simply closed her eyes and sighed softly. There was no joy, no peace in her soul, only emptiness. After brewing another cup of coffee, Sarah brought the cup to her lips, trying to hide the emotions that had now become part of her daily life. The cafe was just as she remembered it, cozy with wooden tables and the smell of old coffee, and it was here that she and Thomas had once first realized they were meant for each other. Or so it seemed. Life, as always, decided to set things up a little differently. "Sarah, you couldn't forgive me, could you?" Thomas looked at her again, like a painting that was both familiar and completely foreign. He held his breath like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to step forward or not. Sarah slowly set the cup aside and looked up, her eyes now devoid of the spark that was there when she sat with him in their shared home. Her face remained calm, but inside it felt like a storm was brewing. Could she forgive someone who had once been everything and now was just a memory that hurt? "You want me to forgive you for everything?" Her voice was cold, but it carried such depth of pain that Thomas could have drowned in it. "You want me to become that woman again, the one you looked at like your queen?" He was silent. Honestly, Thomas didn't know how to talk about what had happened. They had lost Jacob, and that had been a mutual disaster for both of them. But now, in this moment when they met again, he realized that none of those words could bring them back to life, and certainly not bring them back to happiness. Sarah was no longer the woman he fell in love with, and he knew that. "We both destroyed everything, Sarah," he confessed, lowering his gaze. "Both you and I, but I needed to say this. I'm willing to do anything so that you can at least feel that I deserve a chance for both of us." Sarah laughed quietly. This laugh was full of pain, sarcasm, and everything that had become harder for her to hide with each passing year. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held back, trying not to show her weakness. "You're telling me again that you want to try?" Sarah paused for a moment, her voice barely audible. "We both lost Jacob, Thomas, and now you're offering what? To be happy again? You're saying that to me as if I can forget what happened." Thomas felt her words wound him deeply. He knew he had destroyed their happiness, and he felt ashamed. He wanted to fix it, but didn't know how. He reached out to her, but Sarah pulled away, as if her pain was too intense for a touch to help. "You know, Thomas," she said, her voice now firm, "I don't know what to do with this. You say you're willing to do everything, but you've forgotten what it means to love. You just don't know what it's like to live with this pain every day." Thomas sighed. He wanted to say something comforting, but it seemed that all the words he had were too weak for this moment. "You can forgive me, Sarah, you just have to do it," he said softly. "You deserve to be happy again. And I do too." Sarah closed her eyes and felt a tear roll down her cheek. She couldn't explain why it hurt so much. Why did Thomas still say these words that sounded like forgiveness, but were actually just an attempt to deal with his guilt? He didn't know what she had gone through all these years. He didn't know how hard it had been for her to stay alive. "You think it's easy, don't you?" She sharply looked at him. "You think I can just forget? We both lost something we'll never get back. But you don't understand. You don't understand how much it hurts now." Thomas, realizing how his words weren't reaching her, closed his eyes. He knew they couldn't go back. They couldn't return to what they once had. He knew he had been too late with this letter, with this meeting. "What now, Sarah?" His voice was hopeless. "How do I deal with this?" Sarah slowly stood up from the table and walked to the window. She gazed out at the street where the city lights twinkled. The city that had once been their home, and now was just a backdrop to their empty lives. She turned to Thomas and said quietly, I don't know, Thomas. I don't know. And no matter how much she tried, she understood that this moment was too heavy for both of them. They had lost everything. And maybe forgiveness wasn't what they needed. What they needed was time. And perhaps they would find it somewhere else. Thomas stood up, walked to the door, but didn't leave. He turned around and quietly said, "I'll wait. And maybe one day you'll forgive me." Sarah didn't respond. She simply closed her eyes and sighed softly. There was no joy, no peace in her soul, only emptiness. A few weeks had passed since the meeting with Thomas, but Sarah couldn't get their conversation out of her head. It was like a ghost that wouldn't let her go, and she knew it wouldn't end so easily. But what could she do? How could she trust someone who had put her through so much pain? Even if she wanted to, she didn't have the strength for it. Work, as always, was her refuge, but even in these familiar tasks, she felt that something was wrong. That day, Sarah sat at her desk, sketching designs for a new project, but her thoughts wandered far away to the days when she and Thomas had dreamed of the future, when they believed they would be together forever, that their love was a strong wall, impervious to any storms. She saw his face again, heard the voice that had once been her support, but now it all seemed so distant, so foreign. Her phone suddenly vibrated on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked at the screen. It was a message from Thomas. "Sarah, I can't stay silent anymore. I need to meet with you. Please, believe me, I've changed. I'm ready to be the person you need." Sarah ran a hand over her face, trying to push away the anxiety. How could he so easily write those words? They were so beautiful, but she had long learned that words were just a pretty wrapper, and inside there might be nothing but emptiness. She didn't know what to do. Her heart pulled toward him, but she feared she would fall into the same trap she had just escaped from. A few days later, they met again. This time, they chose a quiet spot in a small park, away from prying eyes. Thomas was already there, standing by an old bench, nervously, as if it were their first date again. When Sarah approached, he immediately took a step toward her. "Sarah," he almost whispered her name, as if afraid that his words could destroy everything. "I apologize for not realizing how much you suffered before. I was blind and foolish, thinking I could fix everything with my work, but I was wrong." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, Sarah sat down on the bench and looked at him. How strange all this was. She saw him as she had once, but at the same time, he felt like a stranger. He was like a shadow left in her life after the light had disappeared. His words, although they sounded sincere, couldn't bring her back to those happy days. "You think I can just take your word for it?" Sarah finally looked at him, her voice quiet but full of inner pain. "You think I can just forget how we destroyed our family? You think we can get back everything we lost?" Thomas lowered his eyes as if her words had struck him straight in the heart. "I know you don't believe me, and I can't expect you to, but I want to prove that I'm ready to change everything, Sarah. I want you to know that I didn't come back just like that. I want to fix our mistakes." Sarah paused. She couldn't decide what would be the right thing to do. Everything inside her screamed, "Don't believe him. Don't repeat your past mistakes." But on the other hand, she knew she wasn't ready to let go either. She couldn't forgive herself for being alone for so long, for not trying to find a way out of the trap they had fallen into. And now before her stood a man who was also broken, and maybe, just like her, he was trying to find a way out. "Why didn't you say this before? Why didn't you come to me when I was at my lowest?" Her voice trembled. "Why were you so busy that you didn't notice how I was dying inside?" Thomas stepped closer, his gaze full of regret and pain. "I was foolish, Sarah. I thought I could fix everything if I just worked. I was sure that was the right decision. But now I realize I was blind. Forgive me." Sarah looked at him for a long time, and in her eyes there was everything: pain, bitterness, and even some hopeless longing. She couldn't find the strength to answer. It was too much for her, too much for someone who had once believed in miracles. "You want me to forgive you, Thomas." She looked up and met his gaze. "But you forgot that forgiveness isn't something you can just give. It's something that takes time, and I'm not sure I have enough of it." He remained silent, feeling how her words pierced him, but he knew that now everything would depend only on her. "I will wait, Sarah. I won't rush you, but I will wait. I'm willing to wait for as long as it takes, if that helps." Thomas stood next to her, ready to accept her decision, whatever it might be. He knew he had lost much, and now, when the chance was before him again, he was ready to fight for it, like never before. Sarah stood up from the bench and took a few steps forward. She felt her heart beat faster, and it became hard to breathe. Forgiveness was such a heavy burden that she didn't even know if she could carry it. But suddenly, turning around, she said, "Maybe we really could start over. But Thomas, it won't be as easy as you think. And maybe I'll still be looking for answers to questions that have no answers." And without looking back, she walked away, leaving him standing in the shadow of the mistakes they had both made. Weeks passed, and Sarah felt her life slowly returning to its usual rhythm. But now it was a different rhythm. Not the one she had before the tragedy, not the one she had before all their attempts to build happiness. She woke up every day pretending that everything was fine. Work, friends, walks around the city. All of it was just the usual backdrop. But inside her, in her soul, there was an emptiness that didn't go away, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. She tried not to think about what had happened, not to dwell on what was going on with her and Thomas. Sarah couldn't forget that meeting with him, those words he had spoken, the emotions she had felt standing next to him. He was ready to wait, ready to try again. But she didn't know what to do. Forgive him? Start with a clean slate? How was that possible when the memories still cut through her soul? Her phone vibrated again, and instinctively, Sarah looked at the screen. It was Thomas. "Sarah, I need to talk to you. I can't stay silent any longer." Sarah sighed. What else could he possibly say? Was he asking for forgiveness again? Was he offering to start over? But she wasn't ready for that. She couldn't forget all the years they had spent destroying each other. She couldn't go back, even if that's what he wanted. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. What if there was still a chance for them? She picked up the phone and typed a reply. "Okay, let's meet today at 7 p.m. by the old bench." Less than an hour later, she was sitting at the same spot, waiting for him. The same smells, the same sounds, but now she saw it all as part of her past. This place was their history, but she didn't know how much longer she could stay in those memories. He arrived exactly at 7. He had always been punctual, just like when they first started dating. Sarah looked at him and saw that he was the same, but maybe a little more tired. In his eyes, it was all the same, a mixture of hope and fear. He didn't know how to continue, how to rebuild their life. "You came?" she said, not trying to hide her confusion. "Are you really ready to continue?" He sat down beside her, not trying to take her hand, not trying to cross that boundary they both understood. He sat close, but it felt like everything was so far away. "I'm ready, Sarah," he said with such tension, as if each step he took was a new choice. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to win you back. I understand that this will take time, that you won't be able to forgive me right away. But I'm ready to wait. I'm ready to be by your side until you decide that I'm your choice." Sarah felt her heart tighten at his words. She wanted to feel something, even a little hope. But all she felt was pain again. She raised her head and looked at him. "You've always been like this, Thomas," she said, her voice bitter. "You've always been ready to wait and try, but I can't keep searching for answers in the past. I can't spend my life waiting for you to change." He fell silent, and her words hit him straight in the heart. He knew she was right. He knew they couldn't go back to the past, couldn't get back what they had lost. But he still hoped for a miracle. "I'm not asking you to come back to me right away, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet and almost hopeless. "I'm not asking you to become the woman I once knew. I just want you to remember that I love you, and that I'll wait, no matter how long it takes." She clenched her fists, trying to hide the tears that were threatening to spill. She was so tired of this pain. But was this really what she wanted? Was this what she had been looking for? She stood up, got to her feet, and looked at him. "You'll wait, Thomas, but I don't know what you're waiting for," she said. "I can't keep being part of your past. We both need to move on." He didn't say anything in response. He just looked at her, his eyes full of pain and regret. He understood that maybe they could never be who they once were. And that was hard to accept. Sarah took a step back and turned away. He sat on the bench, alone, in the shadow of their past mistakes, and as her heart squeezed, she walked away, not looking back. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the past. Time, it seemed, didn't heal her pain. It only led her into an even more foggy space where none of her decisions seemed right. She tried to put her life back together, to return to her usual rhythm, to focus on work, meet with friends, but every day brought her the same emptiness that she was supposed to endure and forget. When she walked down the street, her thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas. He didn't disappear. His words, his promises, his desperation, all of it lingered inside her like a thick fog with no escape. She thought she had made the right choice, telling him they needed to move on. But now, sitting in her apartment, she felt that her decision had only been an attempt to hide from the pain. The phone vibrated again. It was Thomas. She hesitated before glancing at the screen and sighed. She knew this would be something important, something she couldn't simply ignore. This time, his message read, "Sarah, I can't live without you. Please, give me a chance. One last chance." Sarah closed her eyes. She felt her heart start to beat faster. She was ready to say no, to wave him off and keep searching for her own path. But something deep inside her demanded a response. He was waiting. He was waiting again. She slowly typed a reply. "I'll meet you at 7 in the same park. This is the last time." Her hand trembled as she set the phone down on the table. She wasn't sure if this was the right choice, but something in her chest told her that maybe this was what they had both been waiting for all these years. Too many unspoken words, too many tears shed. She couldn't leave him in this endless waiting, and perhaps she couldn't leave herself in it either. A few hours later, she was there, in the same park, on that same bench. She sat down and gazed at the sky, which was already growing dark. The birds quietly flew away, and everything around seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. Thomas arrived on time. He didn't say a word, simply sat down beside her. There was sincerity in his eyes, but also deep pain. He knew this could be their last chance. He didn't know what would happen next, but he couldn't keep living in this uncertainty. He was ready to accept any answer. And this moment, his last moment, was more important to him than anything else. "Are you really ready to go through this again, Sarah?" His voice was quiet but desperate. She looked at him and felt everything stirring inside her. She understood that her words would be decisive. She couldn't stay in this state any longer. But she also knew that she couldn't give him a promise she couldn't keep. "I don't know, Thomas. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm willing to try," she said, her words barely audible, like a whisper on the wind. "Maybe we need to start by being honest with each other, and begin again, with a clean slate." Thomas lifted his eyes, and now there was no trace of doubt in them. He saw how Sarah was willing to give them another chance, and that was what he had been waiting for. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing he knew for sure. He was ready to go through anything to feel again that they could be happy. "I'm ready," he said, his voice full of resolve and love. "We can get through this. Together." Sarah felt her heart start to race. This moment was important for both of them. It was the moment they could start anew, with fresh strength and a new perspective on life. And in it, there was something incredibly exciting and frightening all at once. She looked at him and finally smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because she realized that maybe they truly deserved a second chance. And maybe this was the moment when they could become the people who learned to forgive and love again. Months had passed since the day Sarah and Thomas decided to start over with a clean slate. It wasn't easy. They both knew that everything would be difficult and that memories would continue to resurface. But now they had become stronger, and despite the pain, they had learned to forgive. And sometimes, maybe, that's the most important step. Sarah and Thomas began to see each other again, to rebuild their relationship. Of course, there were many moments when they both doubted whether they could make it through. But they understood that it wasn't about how you fall, but how you rise. And every day spent with the person who had once been your everything became a small step toward healing. In the end, they found each other. And maybe not in the way it had been before, but perhaps this was the very path they were meant to walk. Time passed, and Sarah and Thomas continued their journey together, knowing that the wounds from their past wouldn't disappear overnight. But each day they spent with each other was a new step forward, despite everything that had once divided them. They had learned to cherish those moments when their lives intersected once again, when their hearts were no longer afraid to open up to each other. Sarah began to feel the lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She started to believe that love not only heals, but also gives the strength to move forward, no matter what had come before. And though her heart still carried the memories of their lost son, she had learned to let go of those feelings. After all, Thomas, just like her, was part of this journey, and together they were ready to seek new horizons of meaning in their lives. A lot of time had passed, and one day, sitting with Thomas in the same cafe where they had started their conversation many years ago, Sarah looked at him and quietly said, "I didn't know that we could make it through this. I didn't know we could find each other again. But I'm happy we tried." Thomas looked at her, his eyes full of gratitude. He knew no words could fully express what he felt. In his heart there was only one thing: gratitude for the chance they had given themselves. "I'm happy too, Sarah," he replied, taking her hand. "We've both been through so much. And maybe the most important thing is that we chose each other, despite everything." They sat in silence, but in that silence there was more than 1,000 words. It was a moment of understanding. They had found each other again despite all the mistakes and all the losses. And now, as they began a new path, they knew that only together could they overcome whatever lay ahead. No one promised them an easy road, but perhaps that was the point. Each step, each new day was their own choice, their own beginning. And that was all they needed. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss new spine-chilling stories. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and share this video with your friends. More eerie and incredible stories are coming soon. The next story is just around the corner. Are you ready to discover what lurks in the darkness?